Whenever you rent or buy a video, you need to be sure that the film you choose is suitable for the audience at home.
Do sit down. We're just about to have some tea.
Ladies and gentlemen, please do not panic, but scream! Scream for your lives!
Hey weirdos, the kettle's boiled. Welcome to Tea for Terror, where we take a favourite horror film and dissect it over a nice cup of tea. I'm your host, Andrew Graves, and my guest today has just seen a weird video and now she's waiting for a call. Welcome back, Erika Bean and Riley.
Hello. You going to say hello? No, she's not. She's going to make noises at them when we don't want her to, rather than when we do want her to, probably.
How are you both doing?
Yeah, not too bad. She's 7 months now, so trying to move around and being an absolute nuisance. And we've all been ill for weeks. So yeah, not doing much of anything other than sitting and watching films.
7 months, bloody hell, 7 months. That's flown by, hasn't it?
It has, isn't it? Yeah.
Wow. Well, she's looking beautiful as ever. Oh, there she is.
She keeps trying to grab my microphone. I'm like, no, you really can't have that. That you can have anything on the desk within reason. The microphone is a no-go.
So it might sound like a stupid question, but have you managed to squeeze in anything else writing wise while you've been doing your mothering bit?
Not much really, no. I've done one review since we last spoke, and it was for Thelma and Louise. I don't think it's been published yet. There's a new Criterion release coming out in the next few days, so that should be up in the next few days. But yeah, that's the only thing I've done recently. I've not had time to do much else.
But yeah, I think it's on BBC iPlayer at the minute, or it was. I'm not. You know what? I'm not seeing Thelma and Louise. I don't think I've seen Thelma and Louise since it came out. So what was that, 30 years ago? 30.
Yeah, something like that. It was early 90s. Yeah, I hadn't seen it probably in about 20 years. I did watch it like when I was a teenager, I think, and I didn't really get it at that point in time. But watching it now, it's brilliant. It's a really, really great film. I really enjoyed it. So it was quite cool to go back to it.
Yeah. There's a really good documentary. It used to be on Netflix. I don't know if it still is. I don't have Netflix anymore, but it's called Misrepresentation. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
No, I don't think so.
It's it's really good. I mean, it'd be good to revisit it. It's got it's obviously about sort of representation of women in films, but it's really interesting. It's really good, and Gina Davis has quite a lot to say on there, and she's kind of campaigned and done a lot of work behind the scenes on stuff. But yeah, it's really good. It's talking about all that kind of stuff of obviously the different interpretations now and different ways people have used it, but that whole it talks about this idea of on the surface giving women more agency, but actually they're still kind of sex toys for the male characters. It's all that kind of. It's really interesting. It's really good.
Yeah, I think like Thelma and Louise really keys into that, because it's like they kind of, the one time they kind of try and go and do something that's just for them, that's for themselves, it all gets completely screwed over by the men that they come across, and it's sort of a perfect example of that. The thing I don't understand is how Ridley Scott was the one that directed it, because how did a stuffy old white guy make that movie? As much as I love Ridley Scott, he's an odd choice of director for that film.
Oh, it's weird, I was talking. I can't remember. I was talking to this about this the other day. But, we're talking about Ridley Scott, and it's like one of those things. It's kind of like I feel like with Ridley Scott, it's kind of like I always think that if someone says Ridley Scott, I always think, Ridley Scott. I like Ridley Scott. It's really cool. But then I think about all of his films. I think no, I mean I like Alien and Blade Runner. That's what I like. I mean, Thelma and Louise, I've not seen for a long time, so I can't remember really. But it's a bit like Primal Scream. It's like people always say, like, "Oh, yeah, I like Primal Scream." It's like, no, you like psychedelia. You don't like Primal Scream. Actually, stuff outside of Primal psychedelia is not. It's not that good. Screamadelica. Sorry, not psychedelia. I don't know. Yeah, I think he's a very he's a talented director, but I don't. A lot of stuff he's done just bit meh. I think, and it just sort of,
He's one of those people where when he's given a really good script, he can make something great, but then he makes Hannibal and it's like, what is this nonsense? Or what's the other one he did? Exodus, Gods and Kings. Have you seen that? It's
yeah.
it's the it's the 10 plagues story basically, but they're all white. It's just the most bizarre thing. You've got it's not Sam Worthington, it's the guy that looks a little bit like him but uglier. What's his name? Anyway, he's a very American white guy and he's playing like Ramesses or something like that, and they've just put like thick black eyeliner on him, and it's like, how was this made in like the 2000s? Everybody, it's awful. It's really bad.
I know it's
Christian
weird.
Bale in it as well, I think.
I mean, some things are obvious sort of clangers, and you think, well, people are going to get cancelled for doing that sort of stuff. But then, oh yes, I know. But yeah, it's like you say, it's like how is this still a thing in the 21st century? It's like,
Yeah.
right, if I'm going to a certain place in Nottingham, I have to drive. Well, not drive. I don't drive. If I'm on the bus or whatever, I go past Hooters, and he's still there. And I'm thinking, how is Hooters? How is Hooters still alive
Odd,
and
isn't it?
well in this century? I don't get it.
Very odd. Kept going by stag do's probably, and businessmen, and that kind of demographic.
Yeah.
What are you whinging about? Yeah.
Anyway,
Very odd.
all right. Yeah. So today we're going to be looking at a Japanese horror film later today. First time we've looked at a Japanese horror film on Tea for Terror. So we'll get back to that later on, the specific film. But in terms of your own experience then, so normally when guests come on here, I ask them how they got into horror, but obviously you've been on before. So I'm not going to do that again. So I wanted to ask about what was your first kind of introduction to Japanese horror? Or even Japanese cinema, really. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it probably would have started with Ring actually. I'm not sure if it was that first or if it was Battle Royale first, but it was when I was sort of in my teens in secondary school, and the Tartan Asia Extreme label started releasing all of these J horror movies on VHS and DVD, and they were popping up on like Channel 4 and stuff late at night occasionally as well. And yeah, so there was a few of those that I saw that way. It would have been Ring, definitely, Dark Water, and the Ring sequels, Battle Royale, which I remember reading about in a magazine. And then because things always took a little while to come out. It's not like now where you get them like maybe a month after you used to get them sort of 6 months to a year later back then. And when I knew that Battle Royale was coming out on VHS, I was walking down to Choices, which was my sort of video rental place, because I had no money. I used to buy X rental videos. They were the only ones that I would buy because you'd get them for like $5. I'd walk down there, and I was walking down every day with my allowance, which wasn't very much, to see if I could get a copy of Battle Royale on video yet, because I was so excited to watch it. But yeah, it was sort of, that was the introduction, and that was moving on from like watching all the old kind of sci-fi movies, like sort of Invasion of the Body Snatchers and stuff like that. And just sort of, it was something I hadn't really seen before, because they're so, I mean, I think when we look at Japanese horror now, you see the sort of creepy figures and the way they move and everything. That's kind of almost become like a horror cliche now. You see it in everything, you see it all the time. But back then we hadn't really seen anything like that before. It was kind of a new weird creepy thing. So yeah, that was my kind of introduction to it.
I think I think when J horror came around, as it became J horror, I mean that's kind of a bit of a cliche in itself now, but I think I think the reason it kind of it keyed in with a lot of people, I mean obviously a lot of it was very, very good, but I mean that wave in the late 90s, early noughties, it came at a time when I think, if you think so, you'd had all your classic sort of horror films, American horror films of the 70s, and that sort of spilled into your slasher films of the early 80s. But then by the time you're getting towards the end of the 80s, the horror, particularly American horror, is looking a little bit ragged. And even though you've got like these kind of small little enclaves of things that are doing interesting stuff, obviously Wes Craven came back with Scream, which
Mm.
kind of subverted a lot of those kind of old tropes. Um, wasn't a great deal happening, I don't think, in terms of American horror. And so I think it was the perfect time for it, really, because it really filled a gap. And also what it did, I think, though, that wave of Japanese horror films, it there was something, even though you had these kind of American remakes eventually, which I'm not necessarily knocking. If it brings, into a new audience, then that's fine. And I think if you've only seen the American version of Ring, it's an acceptable film. It's okay.
Mm.
But I think what it is, it's that kind of what you have with a lot of those Japanese films, which was sorely missing in a lot of American films from that era, was a sense of the uncanny, a sense of the unknown,
Yeah.
and there was something very untranslatable about it. And which is, which, however you want to view those American remakes of those classic Japanese horror films, there is something that stays in Japan. You can't just transfer it. It is about a different culture. It is about a different
Mm.
point. Um, and I think it's interesting because if you go way back in time and you're looking at Japanese cinema, now if you look at like, the beginnings of Japanese cinema, indeed the beginnings of cinema in general. Now we went very quickly from just kind of pointing one camera and it being there to capture almost a theatrical performance. And we soon went from, in Western culture, we went from having editing and time shifts. But interestingly, with Japanese cinema at the start of that, they kind of reject all of that, and they have always done in Japan. They completely went their own way. In early Japanese cinema, you had um they would literally film theatrical performances with one camera. But they would have, in the silent days, they would have, when they showed these films to public, they would have what they called benshai, who were people who would narrate the stories that were happening on
Hmm.
screen. And a lot of times, these benshai would become more popular than the actual film. So people would follow not the films around, but these benshai, depending on how good they were. And so they came into like editing and things like that later on, but I think they've always done their own thing. If you look at, Japanese monster films, a lot of people mistake, in the West particularly, mistake those, the early Godzilla film. Obviously, we've had like Godzilla -1, which is incredible. But a lot of people mistake those early Godzilla films being this idea that they were doing something cheap, or it was a cheaper version of what they were doing in the West. No, it wasn't. It was a complete rejection of what was happening in the West. It
Mm.
was a different art form. And I think with those Japanese horror films that came in the sort of 90s and early noughties, it was, again, it was rejecting, not, I don't mean that in a willfully sort of belligerent way, but this idea of um, rejecting what was happening in the States or wherever, and creating something perfectly in tune with your own culture.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose when you think about the 90s, it was all the kind of postmodern slashers, wasn't it? Like Scream, and then you had like Urban Legend and things like that, which are obviously very simplistic stories. It's a whodunit at the end of the day, isn't it? It's very, it's very pared back. Um, there's probably more in common sort of Japanese cinema. If you were to look at American cinema, it would be something like Seven or something like that, where it's kind of procedural, complex background storyline to it, and there's a lot more of that. And also, there's elements of the storytelling that wouldn't work. And actually, one of the things that doesn't work in the remake is the fact that the the broken family is one thing, and that is something that comes up a lot, but also the fact that the mother is so absent in the child's life in the story that it's sort of in the original version, it's like it's just normal. It's shown as kind of that's just the way children are in Japan, and it's like they're very independent. He comes home, he sorts his own dinner out, he gets himself ready to school, he helps her get ready, he gets her dressed out for her, and all this kind of stuff. And it's like if you had a family like that in England or in America, you'd be like, there's some red flags here. This is not normal parenting. But I think in Japan culturally, it's normal, and that's how they raise their children, is to be very independent and to be very self-sufficient. And so it's like it's just interesting to get this kind of view on family life and just the culture and how different it is, that just doesn't really, it's just so different, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think and again, this is speaking in general terms, but it's almost like if you think about a lot of typical Western sort of horror films or American horror films, even there is kind of an obsession with dry, kind of dry places like dusty old mansions or whatever. Whereas in Japanese culture, there are lots of links. It's very wet. It's very linked to
they're very
water.
damp horror films.
Yeah, and it's all, and I think that's because in terms of mythical sort of Japanese culture and links to certain religions and folklore, it's this idea of water, bodies of water being the sort of link to the afterlife and the other world, if you like. So I think there's a lot of that. And obviously, when we get more into the chosen film, there are lots of links in terms of imagery, which is definitely linked into that sort of mythology and those legends and that folklore and sort of ghosts and things like that, which we'll get into. But also, I think the other thing about Japanese films, Japanese horror films in particular, is this clash, this coming together of the modern and the traditional. And it
Definitely.
is, obviously with a film that we're going to be talking about later, but all the way through, even from, the likes of Godzilla, 1954, clearly, this is kind of looking at a legendary sort of monster and sort of some of those kind of, that kind of history, all this kind of folklore and all this kind of stuff. And then it's clashing with the modernity of the atomic bomb or the atomic age, but all the way through, things like Tetsu, the Iron Man. There are numerous examples of this in Japanese horror cinema, and I think it's and obviously, without wanting to go over old ground that's been talked about before, they are the only country in the world that has suffered two atomic blasts, in a war situation. So that is going to change you as a country. That is going to make you a different country to, wherever, so all of this kind of stuff is pouring into it. And the sort, like I said, the tradition and the culture and the sensibility of that kind of that country and the people that are in that country. So all this is pouring into it, I think.
And yeah, as you say, we'll go into some of there's a lot of sort of ghosts that pop up in the films, but we can go into that a bit later.
Yeah, so I think we'll go into the chosen film. So the film we're going to be looking at is Hideo Nakata's Ring from 1998. So, Erica, when was the first time you came across this film?
Well, I can't remember how I actually got hold of it. I think I recorded it on Channel 4 on video, as you would back then. And I watched it by myself. I think my parents were off away somewhere. So I was in the house by myself in the attic, watched it on my old CRT telly in the dark. I was about 15 and it scared the absolute shit out of me. I think I slept with the light on. It was terrifying. But yeah, I think I just read about it in a magazine or something, and or somebody had recommended it to me and managed to get hold of it. I was very excited to watch it, not really knowing much, and then was like, oh my goodness, what have I got myself in for at the end?
Yeah, I think I came across my mate recommended it. I think he'd seen it. He'd not long since been out, and he kind of recommended it. So I got managed to get a copy. And I think the thing about Ring is it's one of those films that I know is is important to me, because if I think back about it, I've had a VHS copy, I've had a DVD copy, and now I've got the
Yeah,
Blu-ray copy.
same. Yeah.
It's one of those things that's just followed me for the last 20 years or so. So yeah, and I remember. I mean, I quickly kind of went after. Not long afterwards, I managed to get to see. I saw Ring 2 and then Ring Naught, which we can talk about those in a bit. But yeah, I you know, I kind of sort of enjoyed those. They're all right, but there's something very special about the first Ring, I think. The thing that struck me when I watched it again the other day is how, for a lot of the film, I mean, I can, not that I would agree, but I would understand why a lot of people wouldn't like the film. I think there are there are really scary moments in it, but I can understand why people might be, you know, might not see it as a classic if they saw it now for the first time. Because and this is what I like about it, I think this is what makes it work, is that for a lot of it's just two journalists kind of going on.
Yeah.
It's just an investigation. It's almost like, it is a classic sort of two journalists trying to find the truth kind of film. But then you're thrown into this world which nobody fully understands as well. And even though they're trying to search for this truth and find out what was happening and what happened to this girl called Sadako, you know, the moments where it actually takes off and becomes a full-on 99% horror film it's still, I mean, I watched it again the other day. God knows how many times I've seen this film, but watching the scene towards the classic scene, which people have kind of used and copied or whatever, but where we eventually see Sadako emerging from the well and then emerging from the television screen and crawling across the floor, and these moves, as you mentioned earlier on, it's still incredible. It's just an amazing scene.
Mm. Yeah, it's creepy. I mean, I think I've seen it so many times that I don't necessarily find it scary anymore, like I did the first time I watched it. But you can still enjoy it for the procedural element, and that's why I sort of said it's got more in common with like David Fincher films, than where you've got kind of, there's the procedural and it's kind of investigative journalism like Zodiac and Stefan and things like that, but then there's little moments that are fucking terrifying dotted through it. But it's only really, I mean, the opening scene and the end scene, it's kind of bookended really with these two moments of horror, and then the rest of it is just the investigation. But I mean, that's what makes it carry on working, because there's the depth to it of storytelling. It's not just about getting that little rush from the horror. That's not all there is to it. There's more to it than that, which makes it proliferate and keep being watchable over a longer time. And I mean, sort of talking about the sequels, and that they try and add these little bits of extra story in there, but they don't really add anything. They're not actually needed, because you've got everything summed up in this sort of 90 minutes. It's just a perfectly formed story that just works really, really well. Even if you're not scared by it, even if you're not there for the horror, you're kind of pulled in by the story.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that. I think, what the sequels do, or the pre whatever, adding these added layers of information, you don't need it. That's why Ring works so well, is because you are left with these question marks, and it's just an it's just an oddity. I mean,
Mm.
just the actual video that they see with the eruption thing on and all that. It's just how, I don't even know how you even come up with something like that. It's just
Mm.
you couldn't recreate that, really. You couldn't think, well, let's do something like that. There is nothing like that. It's just fucking weird. And it's really fucking I mean, even if you take it completely out of context and you just gave, if literally just gave that clip and said, just watch this, they'd be like, what the fuck is this?
Yeah, and you can see it on the characters' faces when they watch it at the end. Their faces are like, "The fuck did I just watch? Why did I put myself through that?"
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's. I mean, one of the things, obviously, like we said, I mean, the thing with this film, it really keys into that idea of clashing the modernity with tradition, and obviously, what we have here is the link between the sort of the other world or whatever it is, and that the traditional ghost character, if you like, accessing our world through television, or more specifically videotape or VHS or whatever. So I mean, and again, I think there's some. I watched it again. I mean, I've got it on Blu-ray, but I watched it on. I think just for convenience, because I was at my laptop. I watched it on Arrow, Arrow, the Arrow film player, whatever.
Mm.
Um, and it's nice, watching it sort of crystal clear Blu-ray. But there is all, I think, as the film suggests, I think this is kind of, it is one of those films that you kind of should see on VHS. And it is, you should watch it on a third hand copy. If there's someone's copied you, because there's something
It
so
used to
so
be,
odd
wasn't it?
about it.
Used to be with videos where, like, if you got somebody had copied a video for you, every time it got copied, the quality would degrade just that little bit more, to the point where you can only just sort of make out the dialogue, and it was just awful. But even watching it on Blu-ray, though, the way it's been directed is that it's so, the colors are so stripped back, and it's so, it pared back and almost grainy and grey, and so that it still has that kind of old VHS kind of quality to it. It's still, even in high definition, it still has a little bit of that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in there as well. The way that the character moves is kind of, and which, as you said earlier on, has been kind of copied a lot. It's almost become a cliche. But in this film, it was kind of like, no one was kind of came out of nowhere, particularly if you're watching it as, if you're in the West watching it.
Mm.
But apparently it came from this idea. There was this kind of dance called Buto. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it was kind of this really strange, weird, exotic dance that was kind of inspired by the horrors of all the stuff that had happened during World War II. So there was kind of these sporadic, strange, weird sort of movements in this kind of this dance. So I think they took a lot of inspiration for that. But also in sort of Japanese folklore, you've also got this idea of what's called and again, excuse my pronunciations, but a yurei, which is kind of like, they are sort of ghostly figures from Japanese folklore. But also, but if you look at, if you Google in those images of the Yurei and sort of Japanese folklore and ghosts, what you get is like these older sort of paintings or these illustrations. basically is Sadako. This is kind of all based on it's all white robes, long black hair. Um, but that Sadako, I think, obviously they took that idea and translated that into the American version, and but I just think again, there's something untranslatable. There's something about Sadako in Ring, and it's the eye. There is something so I remember my mate, that the same guy that I was mentioning that had actually recommended the film to me initially. He'd he'd managed to, because it was fairly early days of the internet and computers, but he'd managed to print off. I don't know if you remember, we used to be able to get these. You probably still can, but you used to be able to get these this special paper you could put in your printers, and then if you got an image from the internet, you could print it off, and then you could just peel it off, and you could iron it onto a t-shirt. And
Oh, right, yeah.
they used to last about like 10 minutes, before they stopped
Yeah.
peeling off. But if you
Great for
just
stag
wanted,
do's and things like that. And yeah.
yeah, if you wanted it for one night, it was all right.
Yeah.
He'd done that, and he'd got a massive, like, just close up of Sadako, the eye. And there's just something about that close up. It's terrifying. And I
It's
don't even know, it's
animalistic,
almost
isn't
like
it?
the eye is like, I don't know what they've done with it, or whether it's just the way that they place the camera, or they kind of made the eye bigger in some way. It just looks horrible.
Yeah. And is there's this kind of like thread of kind of, yeah, what you're saying about mysticism and like the sort of the ghosts and the and kind of juxtaposed with the technology. And it's like all the characters in it have got this kind of like low key shining, they're all kind of a little bit psychic, which is odd when you think about, the whole kind of VHS aspect of it and the technology aspect of it. But yeah, it all links back to that conflict, doesn't it, of of technology versus modernity and mysticism and religion and all that kind of stuff. And I suppose part of that, when you sort of say about, their history with World War II, how much they lost in World War II, just because of their approach to warfare involves that they have a massively high body count anyway, because they'll go in and be like, okay, I'll die, that's fine. There's no, culturally, they don't have that kind of self-preservation that an American soldier or a British soldier would do. So they would have lost so much through that, and also through the bombings that happened, that historical things were just destroyed. They lost all of this, so they're kind of trying to claw it back through the culture and through what they make culturally. But they're having to rebuild, and you can build something now and try and make it look old, but it's not going to look old because it's not old, that you can't recreate that. So you've got all these memories of all the old stuff, and you're trying to build the new stuff, but it's all kind of under the surface of all these new shiny buildings and all this new technology, and the fact that they've got all these skyscrapers, and that they're making amazing technology and games consoles and all this, that and the other. You've still got that thread of memory that's linked into mysticism and the boogeyman that they were told about as kids, or whatever the equivalent was, it's all in there still. You can't erase that, even though the visual language isn't there anymore. If the images aren't there anymore, the buildings are gone, but the memory is still there. And I think that's kind of a big part of what it keys into.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. I've not really thought about that idea, particularly, as you said, like, in the aftermath of the atomic blasts, some of those famous images of the shadow, the way you just get literally
Yeah.
like the burned remains of the shadow. That is kind of, you know, symbolic of this, even though the the past in some ways has been blasted away, literally, you've still got an echo of it there. I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting in terms of how different cultures, and again, this is me generalizing, but if you look at a lot of British culture, I think, in the post-war period, but right up until sort of 70s and 80s. And even if you look at sort of a lot of music, obviously we have, we've produced our fair share of decent music in this country, obviously, but if you look at a lot of 70s and 80s stuff, you had a lot of time, even though it might have been dressed up as glam or whatever, there was a kind of, if you look at a lot of those glam bands, Sweet and things like that, which are brilliant, but there's always kind of this, um, you've got a lot of those glam bands wearing sort of German memorabilia or so, this kind of stuff, and it's almost like an obsession with the past because we won the war, and it's almost like it was safe for us to have a nostalgia. Whereas if you look at German culture and look at German, say, music, look at the krautrock of the sort of 70s and 80s, that's very forward thinking. It's not looking back at all. It's futuristic. It's using new technology because they were not afforded the luxury of being able to have to be nostalgic about the past. And I think that it's similar with Japanese culture. They took the idea of technology and the future and ran with it. For a lot of time, even now, if we look at sort of technology and the next thing, we tend to look at Japanese culture and Japanese technology. But as you said, there is this thing of, well, not entirely letting go of the past. But it's retaining certain elements of the past. Whereas I think, in this country, we have completely made up a version of the past which never existed,
Oh, big time.
which you can blame for, I don't want to get all political, but if you look at, the idea of Brexit and this idea of we can make it better again, and particularly in the States as well, make America great. It never was. It's just
No,
let
it
go of
goes
that.
back. Well, that goes back to sort of the language of early British and American fascism, doesn't it? The sort of the Britain First stuff. It's the black shirts and make Britain great again. It's the language has been there since then, so that all links back to that, doesn't it? I suppose.
Oh, yeah, so okay, so I think we should talk a little bit about the plot for those that may be listening to this and not aware of what it's in some ways it's a fairly simple plot. Um, but then as ever, there are these really interesting avenues and angles which they go off, which make it also complicated at the same time as being simple. It's you've got to experience it to understand the simplicity and the complexity of this. So, I mean, basically what it centers around the idea that, there is a video tape or a recording being passed around to people. And if you watch this thing, you get a phone call and then you die 7 days later. And there have been proven examples of this, and people have actually died. So, um, and so what deepens the plot is the female protagonist who has a young kid. What makes it terrible, or what gives us this kind of ticking time bomb, is the fact that her son has watched it. So she is expecting her child to die. So you've got this added thing. But it is all kind of based on, I think, a lot. You tended to get quite a lot of this in American culture as well. But I think in terms of American cinema, the horror film, so you've gone from kind of the slasher film, and they tried to add sort of different. But you tended to get there was a rash of films about the idea of these kind of weird sort of urban myths or whatever, and I think this taps into that as well. But this is a much scarier, much more effective version of that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, they used to get those emails, didn't you? That would be like, you have to pass this email on, or in 7 days, this ghost will come and get you. And that's basically what the premise of Ring is. I don't know whether those emails came first or the film came first, but it's the same idea. And yeah, there was a slasher movie, wasn't there, called Urban Legend, that was somebody carrying out, the two kids parking, and you hear the scratching on the roof of the car, and it's the boyfriend hanging over the car and all that kind of stuff. It's all a bit naff, really. It's fun, but it's naff. But yeah, I mean, it's that whole kind of thing of to escape from Sadako, you have to sacrifice somebody else. And it's like, do you do that to somebody that you like, or do you tell them that that's what they need to do, that they need to pass it on, that they need to keep paying it forward, or do you trick them into doing it? Or, there's this whole kind of moral conundrum to it once Reiko, the main character, works out that's what she's got to do to save her son. And it's like the only reason she finds that out by accident, because she's shown it to her ex-husband, and then he's died, and she's like, well, why didn't I die? And it's because she'd made a copy and shown it to him. So it's like her, she's inadvertently condemned him. So now she's like, right, okay, how do I save my kid? And I think and she doesn't just show it to a stranger. She goes and shows the videotape to her dad, and it's like, fuck.
I know, that's the thing. It's that phone call. It's like, yeah, I'm on my way. Can you do me a favor? Can you just dial real quick?
Yeah,
you do like your grandson, don't you? Yeah. Well, you might need to do something.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand the logic in a way, because obviously, he's an older guy. It's not as much of a sacrifice as, a younger person or whatever. I can understand that perspective. And again, I think that's a very Japanese view on it, isn't it? It's like, it's sort of a lot of sort of Asian cultures, once they get a bit older, and they would just go for a walk and not come back, I think, in some cultures, in some places there. So you can understand the logic, but it's your dad. It's dark. It's very, very dark.
Yeah, I mean, I'm 53, and sometimes I'll go for a walk and forget to come back.
Yeah, no, I would too, especially when the kids are screaming.
Oh, I mean, one of the other things is kind of like what really does kind of impact this film. I think not just unique to this film. I think if you look at a lot of films from that era, I think people forget. I mean, you kind of almost look back at decades, and you look back at things, and obviously we have, even though we know the truth is much more nuanced than that, and much more complicated, we kind of tend to put decades into boxes, or at least parts of decades into boxes. So if I mean, people tend, we tend to create fancy dress costumes out of decades, don't we? If you say 80s to someone, if you say, oh, you're going to an 80s fancy dress party, they'll probably dress as Madonna or something like that. If you say 70s, they'll probably go as some sort of bastardized version of Mark Bolan or whatever, Flair or whatever. But obviously the truth is much more complicated and straight. If you look at the beginning of the 70s compared to the end of the 70s, it looks like a completely different world. If you look at the beginning of the 80s compared to the end of the 80s, it looks like a completely different world, because things change. And I think one of the things that is weird about modern culture, and I mean, like, today, I think that obviously technology is moving way faster than a lot of us can even comprehend. But I think aesthetically, we've stagnated. If you look at a photograph of someone, or an image of someone from 10 years ago, it's not really going to look any different. The mobile phone might be slightly bigger or smaller or whatever. That's it. Cars look the same, clothes look the same, everything looks the same. Whereas 10 years in other decades kind of spanned, they looked very different. Like 1972 is a different world to 1978, aesthetically. But however, I think what people forget is that the mid to late 90s were a strange kind of place. I mean, in this country in particular, we went through the kind of weird upheavals politically. We went from having, a long as we've got now, a long-serving Tory government, and then that changed, in 97, and things kind of changed. And I think there was, depending on how you looked at it, there was this kind of weird thing in the 90s where everybody kind of felt a little bit safer, find, I'm
Yeah.
not saying there weren't faults and there weren't things that were wrong. Of course there were, but it's kind of like I can't remember worrying about much in the 90s. I was slightly bored, I think, but I don't can't remember worrying about much. Um, but also, I mean, that's to do with my age as well. I was a lot younger then. But I think that it's looking back at it, and particularly if you look at films from the late 90s, is that you forget now because everything's social media, everything is linked to one digital device in your hand that you carry around in your pocket at all times. Everything is connected. It's weird that we had the internet. I remember getting like broadband in like 97. So we got like broadband, we got the internet, we got like emails and things like that. No social media, or not social media as we know it now. But also at the same time as that, people are still smoking in pubs or still
Yeah.
or at the same time it's still VHS technology. It's kind of like a really incongruous time looking back. You got all these things. It was the last sort of time where we had kind of a lot of things, more traditional stuff, mixing with kind of new technologies, but none of us really understanding what was happening. But also not necessarily. I think there's a kind of panic about technology now sometimes, but I think, with AI and stuff like that, quite rightly. But I think then it was kind of like, we've got the internet now. What does this do?
Yeah, you'd go and like you'd download a song and it would take you like half an hour to download a single song and you'd be sat there like, I've got this new song by this person. And like a lot of the time the metadata on it would be wrong as well. It'd have the wrong artist name or whatever. And it was a very, very odd time. But it was like, yeah, it was the 90s was very peaceful. I mean, I was very young, so it would have all been kind of gone over my head. But I remember moving from like John Major to Blair and all that kind of stuff happening. But it kind of all changed in like 2001, didn't it? Because you had 9/11 happened. And then that influenced film in America, where you suddenly got this wave of partly disaster movies and then also hyper patriotic movies. And, sort of that changed things there. And it was like, things like disaster movies changed, didn't they, after 9/11? You went from like the 90s era of things like Volcano and the what's the other one, like Independence Day and things like that, where it's like, yeah, Team America, woo, we're amazing. And then you got things that were a lot darker and a lot more subdued. And it was like that was kind of 9/11 was almost their Hiroshima, wasn't it? It was kind of, it changed their landscape in a way that they couldn't have anticipated. And then, I mean, for us, I suppose the equivalent would be the July 7th bombings, but they were horrific, but not to the extent, I don't think, of something like 9/11. They weren't as world changing as 9/11 was.
No, I think cinematically, you kind of like, we went, like you said, went from like Independence Day. I mean, I love Independence Day. It's
It's
ridiculous.
great
I
fun.
love it. From that to Cloverfield. Cloverfield's a darker
Fucking love
film.
Cloverfield.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's great. But and again, if you look at something like Batman 89, that's a very 80s, very, very 80s film. It's very bright.
Yeah.
All this kind of, it's dark and gothic, but it's also bright at the same time and, multicolored and all this Tim Burton fantasy-esque stuff. But, when it comes to Dark Knight, a post 9/11 Batman film, I mean, that is kind of, the Joker is very much PTSD in human form, isn't he? He is
Yeah.
that's this is a country that really cannot cope with this, cannot cope with what's happened and cannot cope with how the government or whoever, CIA, whatever you want to look at it, is coping, is dealing with this situation in making its own citizens, feel like prisoners within their own country. It's people forget how many rights, civilian rights, were kind of thrown away, under the Patriot Act and stuff like that. It's just gone and it's never coming
Mm.
back. You may never have another disaster like that or a terrorist event like that ever again. But those rights have gone. They're not coming back. It's yeah, it's a weird thing. But yeah, I think you're right. I think, um, obviously Japan had that. That's part of their history, whereas it's still fairly a new thing to America, and I think they're still kind of getting around it. And cinematically, like I said, the shift from, your Independence Days to Cloverfield and that darker stuff. Yeah, and it's interesting. There's Adam Curtis. Adam Curtis. Adam Curtis? He does like these kind of really good documentaries, which are kind of
No.
summing up sort of modern culture. But he talks about this kind of 9/11 thing, and it's almost like if you look at those disaster films that came in light of that, they are almost not necessarily deliberately, but because cinema doesn't really happen in a vacuum. It's influenced by culture and what's happening in society. A lot of those disaster films that came after 9/11 were very much, you could argue, as being sort of psyching up the American people for what was about to come and what America was about to unleash on the world. This kind of big, horrible, creating these enemies. We have, this is the thing about not just America, but our culture as well. We have to have enemies. We have to have enemies to keep the war machine going, to keep the money coming in, to keep the tax dollars coming in. Got to keep
Yeah.
creating these enemies. If it's not a Soviet communists, it's, brown people in the Middle East or whatever, or, Russians or whatever it is, it's got to have an enemy, got to
We've
have
got to
an
be
enemy.
scared of somebody. We've got to be
Yeah.
scared of somebody because it means that you keep voting for the right people, don't you? And it's like, yeah. And it's, I suppose you're saying about technology as well. It's fascinating that the first, you're saying about Cloverfield, that it's a found footage movie, and you're talking about this loss of freedom, and it's the fact that everybody now has a camera in their pocket. And I think like Cloverfield almost kind of saw that happening before it happened, if you know what I mean, because it was like it was just a coincidence that somebody happened to have a camera in the plot of that film. Whereas if you were to make it now, it would be everyone would just get their phone out as soon as shit starts going down. You'd be like, oh, I'll get my phone out and film this and put it on YouTube or well, Reels or TikTok or whatever it is people do these days. And so it kind of anticipated that lack of privacy that you have now, that everybody has a camera in their pocket, and
Yeah.
the how easy it is to just keep sharing and proliferating things, because it's like they did one of the Ring, like American Ring sequels, I think it's called Rings, and it's based on like an internet version of the video, isn't it? And I haven't actually seen it because it looks terrible, but um it's like I can't imagine it working in the same way because it doesn't have that tactility to it that you have with like a videotape that you put it in the machine and you press play and you sit there and you really engage with something like people did a lot more before you had this constant stream of visual information being thrown at you all the time.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned there like one of the sequels, remakes, or whatever. I mean, how much have you kind of invested in those sequels, prequels, whatever?
I've seen Ring 2 and Ring O. I actually watched them both this week. I tried watching Spiral, which is the original like Ring sequel, the Japanese one. And basically the entire film was people talking about stuff that happened in the first film. It's one of the most boring things I've ever watched. I only managed about an hour of it and that literally nothing happened. It was so dull. Um, Ring 2 is pretty much the same. Lots of people rehashing stuff that happened in the first one. Ring O is interesting in that it really humanizes Sadako in a way that I'm not sure if it works or not. It's odd. The remakes I don't mind. They're okay. The biggest issue I find with them is that they're massively over directed. Like they're so hyper stylized, and it's like you've got this. You can tell like the videotape that they make in the remake is so like, oh, this means this means this means this represents this, and it's like they tease out every single bit represents something, and I don't feel like that really was what the original one was about. It was literally just a stream of consciousness. It wasn't so much you had to tease out every little element of it. And it was so clean and shiny and lovely. And then, when the big scene at the end where the guy gets killed, she's not just a person anymore. She's like a ghost with like a grey face and a scrunched up growly face, and you actually see it, and it just feels very overcooked, I think, when you watch the remakes, and in a way that changes the impact of them, I think.
Yeah, like I said, it's the sense of the uncanny. That's what I will always, I don't mind kind of more visceral, sort of more obvious forms of horror. I like a good slasher sometimes. I like, things that, splatter movies and things like that,
Mm.
which don't really leave a lot to the imagination. That's fine. But really what I am most attracted to, and why I gravitate towards horror films in general, are those films that have this sense of the unearthly or the uncanny, almost that the H.P. Lovecraft effect almost. It's something that you can't explain, something that doesn't have to be explained, because it just is weird. I'm not going to explain
Yeah.
why it's weird. And if you don't get it, you don't get it. That's fine. But that's what I want. And that's the moments in this film, in Ring, the original. Um, like I said, I've seen the first American remake, and yeah, like I said, if that's the only one you've seen, I'm glad people enjoy it. It's okay. Um, but it's just not. I'm not going to be one of those people that say, "Oh, well, it's a remake. I'm very stuffy about re." I'm not. Some of the best, but horror films have been really good remakes. But however, there's just something about the original Japanese film. You can't replicate it, and you can't reproduce it. There's something about the uneasiness, the strangeness, how off kilter it is, and just how odd it feels. Just those shots of the well that we get at the beginning, this kind of these hints, the fact that it is so grainy and is so obviously been copied and copied and copied, and it's just you can't make out certain things, the letters on the page jumping around, the eruption thing. It's just not,
Mm.
you can't really describe, if you see, this is what I mean. You could imagine with the remake, a writer's room full of people. It's like, oh, how do we do that? How do we tap into an American audience? How can we? And you're missing the point. If you're trying to explain this, you're missing the point. It shouldn't be explained. It should be just there. It's a feeling. It's creating a feeling. It's not there to offer you any sort of literal explanation.
No, and it's like, yeah, the videotape that they made in the remake is very much it's like an art film. It's like they've gone into an art installation and made an art film. It's like you've got this ladder against a white wall, and then it falls over, and then it's like, what does it represent? It's like, I don't know, stuff, something, but that's not really what the original one was about. And I think that whole kind of the better thing to have come from Ring in terms of like more mainstream filmmaking, and what we're more likely to see here is films that aren't direct remakes, things like It Follows and Smile, kind of, but not as much. But It Follows especially, you can see that there's a major link there to Ring, and it's a much more successful film than one that tries to actually just copy it, because it takes something that's about youth culture and American culture, and and STDs and all this kind of stuff, and uses Ring as a jumping off point rather than actually just copying it. It's putting their own culture onto it, so
Yeah.
it's much more successful.
And I think, you can have, say, American remakes that work really well. the first time I saw Solaris was the American version, and then I went back to the Soviet version later on. Obviously you could argue the Soviet version is superior, blah blah blah. But I think what they do with the American version is that they're not trying to recreate the you can't. What would be the point in trying to recreate a Soviet era science fiction film from the early 70s? There's no point. What you can take is the initial idea from the original novel and some of the elements of the original film, but what you do is put it into a very American film, which taps into American culture and taps into American fears and taps into that overly therapized American culture. That's what really, if that's what works about the American remake. So you can do it, but like you said, it's not. And where America or even British remakes or whatever, where it will fail is where you're trying to replicate someone else's culture. You can't really do that. You have to tap into what's happening in your culture and your immediate surroundings or your society. That's what's gonna, as I've said before, Barbie, whatever you think about Barbie, it was a huge film, huge success. Obviously, there's controversy with the Oscars this week, which I won't get into, but I don't really fuck about the Oscars. The Oscars is always bollocks, This idea, suddenly the Oscars is a load of bollocks. It's always been fucking bollocks. But Barbie, like I've said, Barbie tapped into something, and what they tapped into was not what's now being misinterpreted by other producers. How can we, let's which Mattel product can we exploit next? That's not why it was popular.
No.
That's just part of the reason why it's popular. But the main reason was because it was, it's original, it's innovative, and it had something to say. If you've got nothing to say and you're just doing another Mattel product, then people aren't going to tap into that.
No.
Have you seen, just as an offshoot, have you seen, obviously it's a Japanese film, have you seen Godzilla -1?
No, I haven't. It's not been showing anywhere near me, and the only screenings I can go to at the moment are the ones that they let you take babies to. Um, so I'm very limited by what the local indie cinema puts on, and they tend to go for like the old people movies. So I've seen The Great Escaper and things like that recently at the cinema more than I have stuff that I particularly want to see, which is a shame.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, if you do get to see, if you get to see it on a streaming site or whatever, or if it comes out
Yeah,
when it
no,
comes
I'm
out
I'm
Blu-ray,
gonna I'm gonna be buying it when it comes out. I'm really excited to see it.
it's really good and it taps into a lot of what we were saying earlier on. I mean, obviously it's set literally just after the Second World War, and the aftermath of that. So it's tapping into a lot of that. But it just looks incredible. I'm not entirely sure how they do it. Obviously, there's CG involved, but it doesn't look like your normal CG film. It looks fantastic, really, really great. Yeah, I loved it. It's fantastic. So yeah, I envy you that you've not seen it yet. So I'm going to buy it when it comes out as well. Um, yeah, okay. I think we've covered it. So have you got any plugs? Nothing coming out.
No, I'm really boring at the moment, I'm afraid. So yeah, not much going on. If you want to look at my Instagram, there's basically baby pictures on there, but that's about it really. That's all my
Any
life.
any more babies?
No, never again. I'm done. Thanks very much.
You've
The
you've
shop is
done your
closed.
you've done your Torah duty.
I'm
Uh,
closed for business.
uh, well, she's lovely. So yeah, so as always, please follow us on Facebook. And if you get a second, if you listen to this podcast and you like it, please write us a nice review because that'd help with our distribution and it'll just help to get our name out there and make more people listen to it. So it just remains for me to say thank you to Erica and Riley.
You're very welcome. She's not saying anything.
She's not saying anything,
No, for
stunned
once.
into silence.
Been
Yes.
asleep for most of it.
So thanks for coming back on. Another return guest. Been lovely to talk to you again. Always a pleasure. Never a chore. But remember to call round next time. Make yourself at home. You look like you're dying for a nice cup of tea for terror.
And remember, my friend, future events such as these will affect you in the future.